When I was in high school, I went on a mission trip to Guatemala. Specifically, I went to a small village outside Chiquimula, Guatemala. Going to Guatemala was the first time that I saw anyone in person that really lived in extreme poverty and was malnourished. I was already interested in economics at the time, and after that trip, I became specifically interested in development economics because I want to try and address economic problems that lead to poverty. In this video, I will explain the historical development of the food economy in Guatemala, explain policies and processes related to the region, and examine the culture of Guatemala and how that impacts the country. Guatemala is a mountainous country with land area about the size of Pennsylvania and a population of about 15 million people, making it the most populous country in Central America. Guatemala also has the highest fertility and growth rates in Latin America. Guatemala is predominantly poor and struggles particularly with health and development. Agricultural land is 41.2% of Guatemala's total land, and the agricultural sector accounts for 13.7% of GDP and 32% of the labor force. Some key agricultural exports include sugar, coffee, bananas, and vegetables. A large problem that Guatemala faces is the marginalization of the indigenous population. Poverty among indigenous groups is 73%, with 22% of them living in extreme poverty. The historical development of the Guatemalan agricultural economy starts with the Spanish colonization in 1524. During the colonization period, Guatemala's main export was indigo, used in dyes. After the introduction of synthetic dyes wiped out the market for Guatemala's main exports, Guatemala turned to other products, such as cocoa. Gradually, Guatemala's main exports turned to agricultural products that are similar to other countries in Latin America today, such as coffee, sugar, and bananas. Today, Guatemala is morphing into a more services and commerce-based economy, although a significant portion of the population still works in agriculture. Mountains and dense forests combined with a lack of reliable water source makes farming in Guatemala difficult. One unfortunate aspect in the development of the agricultural economy was the land expropriation by the economic elite. Private property rights were needed to produce coffee for exporting, and legislation was passed that allowed the elite to take away large plots of land for plantations that had been previously communally owned by indigenous people. There are some location and socio-economic factors that led to the poverty that I saw in the Guatemalan village outside Chiquimula, Guatemala. One location factor is that it was a couple of hours' ride on a bumpy, mountainous road to get to the village. Because these people are so far away from a city, they are also far away from a good school. Without a good school, the children that live in this community will not get an education that enables them to become literate and acquire skills that they can use to be successful in a career. Fortunately, I was working with a group that had established a school in the village so that the surrounding children could have a good education. The rural poor account for more than 70% of the country's poor population. A socio-economic factor that relates to the situation of poverty is the marginalization of the indigenous people. According to an article from Interpress Service News, indigenous people make up 40% of the population of Guatemala, but yet Guatemala has never had a president who is a Native American, and only 19 of 158 members of the Congress are Indians. 80% of Guatemala's farmland is held by 5% of farmers. There are some policies in place for poverty reduction that focus on rural development. Internal sources of policy came out of the Peace Accords of 1996 in Guatemala. The Peace Act led to acknowledgement that policies needed to be put in place to overcome poverty and social and political exclusion. Since 1996, public spending has been expanded in rural areas and policies have been put in place to promote agricultural exports. External sources of policy have come from technical assistance from international development agencies. One policy that could reduce poverty is to develop and invest in small-scale agriculture. If small-scale agricultural farmers' incomes rise, they will demand more goods and services on domestic markets, leading to higher employment in other areas of the economy. Furthermore, since most small-scale farmers are indigenous people, those should help reduce the marginalization of the indigenous groups in Guatemala. To aid small farmers, Guatemala needs to invest in ways to improve agricultural productivity, including ag research, infrastructure for transportation, and access to financing for small farmers. The culture of having a superior class that has been established over the centuries has had a major impact on the poverty and inequality in Guatemala today. However, Guatemala is not the only country in the region that has this problem. Honduras, which borders Guatemala, also has large inequality and a marginalized indigenous population. An estimated 71% of indigenous people in Honduras live below the poverty line. This phenomenon of a large gap between indigenous people groups and descendants of former colonists is persistent to some degree throughout most of Latin America. Although Guatemala is plagued by problems of inequality and simply subsistence agriculture for many farmers, everything is not negative. Policies have been put in place to aid rural development. Furthermore, I have met people who work at a rural school and spend their life to invest in indigenous children's futures. Although these people are poor and malnourished, they have hope and a happiness that money cannot buy. When I went to Guatemala, I was inspired to learn more about the problem of poverty and how to combat it. I hope that this video has inspired you to do the same.